Good afternoon. My name is Haley Foster, and I am a manager on the Public Service Leadership Institute team here at the Partnership for Public Service. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And for some of you, we recognize that you may be joining us on your lunch hour. We appreciate you spending your time with us. For those of you not familiar with the partnership, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit working to build a better government and stronger democracy through policy advocacy, leadership development, workforce programming, and convening leaders across organizations and sectors. The Public Service Leadership Institute at the partnership focuses on training and developing leaders of all experience levels in the federal, state, and local government. At the Institute, we believe that great public service leaders are called by their commitment to public good to exercise stewardship of public trust through 4 key competencies: becoming self-aware, engaging others, achieving results, and leading change. These are all components of our public service leadership model. Today's questions will highlight a number of these areas, but if you'd like to learn more about the model, you can check out our website. Before digging into today's conversation, I wanted to share a few notes. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit a question through the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer what we can. Given the complexity of the topics we discuss, we may not be able to address every question or associated circumstance that comes up today. If you miss a talking point or want to revisit parts of the conversation that are most relevant to you, you can view this conversation and other past webinars on our YouTube channel or read our blog recaps of previous leadership labs. We'll put those links in the chat shortly. Today's webinar is specifically focused on the practical strategies and leadership skills required to succeed when you're leading in multiple roles or managing competing priorities. We will discuss pressing questions like how to manage staff who are also managing multiple responsibilities and roles, balancing multiple roles and avoiding burnout, as well as navigating new roles that are not just new to you, but have recently been created on top of your regular responsibilities. To get us started, I'll turn it over to today's moderator, Jenny Mattingley. Jenny is the Vice President of Public Policy and Stakeholder Engagement here at the partnership. If she looks familiar, you might have seen her moderating one of our Fed support webinars over the last year and a half. If you have questions about specific policies being implemented at the federal level, Jenny and her team have probably created a resource for it. Those resources can be found at fedsupport.org. Jenny, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Haley, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. We've got a great group of panelists for you to really dig into a topic that is familiar for anyone who's served in federal service across administrations. I've been in and out of government myself a couple different times, and whether it's through transition, through people coming and going in federal service, many of us have had the experience of doing multiple roles at one time or dual hatting, wearing multiple hats. And we've brought together some folks who have quite a bit of experience and quite a bit of perspective to share on this that's hopefully helpful to all of you as you're thinking about this. And I know particularly now with a lot of the upheaval in people serving still in agencies and people leaving, it might be more common to have multiple roles right now in doing the work of multiple people or overseeing people who are running multiple roles. So with that being said, I'd love to have our panelists introduce themselves and just give you a quick snapshot of who they are, where they are currently, and maybe a little teaser on some of the roles that you've held previously. I'm going to go in a circle on my screen. So Temika, over to you.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Temika Edwards, and I currently serve as the Chief Financial Strategy and Risk Officer for the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence Research, where I oversee not just budget, but a bifurcated budget relationship with the department and with the IC, the intelligence community, while also leading strategic planning, performance, enterprise risk management, you name it. I spent nearly 2 decades helping organizations integrate risk strategy and performance across agencies like Transportation Security Administration, DHS Office of Inspector General, HUD Office of Inspector General, and now, as I stated, the Department of State. Throughout my career, my focus has been helping leaders navigate complexity on topics like this, making data-driven decisions and aligning people, resources, and priorities to drive meaningful results. I'm excited to join you all today on leading across multiple roles and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Nikki, you're next on my screen. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. Good morning. I hate to have to follow Dr. Edwards, but my name is Nikki Wood. I currently work at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I serve as their Associate Chief Risk Officer, the Director of Oversight and Accountability. I'll explain a little bit about what that is and what that entails, and also the agency's liaison function between our regulatory oversight bodies. So GAO, Office of Inspector General, and making sure that those relationships and partnerships are working and positive. So part of my portfolio also includes payment integrity. So any money that leaves the agency, are there controls in place? Is it used for the right purpose, time amount, in compliance with agency terms and conditions? To CFR, also the internal control function. So think your assurance packages, OMB Circular A123. I mentioned the audit liaison function, also serving our policies. So I also have financial policies in our wheelhouse. And then recently I led the chartering of a risk management council that established our first enterprise risk appetite. So I also am responsible for making sure that the risk management council is functioning, doing all the things that the lovely charter says that they're supposed to do. So just a few things, right? I'm sure there could be more, but I'm excited to be here. One of my top priorities is leadership and making sure that the team is growing and evolving and understands how to manage, I will say stress. I don't want to say conflict. One of my biggest mottos is that pushback creates opportunities for clarity, whether that's mine or theirs. So we welcome that in those discussions. So I'm looking forward to being here, and thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. And Vince, over to you.
Thank you so much. Again, I join my distinguished colleagues in thanking everyone for coming today. I'm currently Chief of Staff at the National League of Cities. I've been here for a short period of time, and although I'm not acting for someone, I am assuming a lot of duties and responsibilities for areas where we have short-term vacancies to help keep the ball rolling on some things. I spent 34 years working for the federal government at 5 different agencies: Justice, Homeland Security, Treasury, Commerce, and Labor. And at all of those agencies, well, except for Commerce, I acted in a series of capacities while I was fulfilling my current role. DHS, I used to joke at the time I was at DHS, everyone had more than one hat that you had to juggle. But most recently, when I was at the Department of Labor during the presidential transition, I was the senior career official at the department and served as acting secretary. I also concurrently served as acting deputy secretary and acting assistant secretary for management for a period of time. So at one point in time last year, I was in the 3 top positions, which means I had no one to delegate to, which created some interesting and unique challenges. But also, I've noticed in the times when I've been acting that there are a lot of opportunities, but there's also different pressures that people need to react to. And I'm looking forward to the conversation we'll have with you today and to the questions we get from the audience.
Great, thank you to all of you. I mean, the experience that you bring today is just incredible. And wow, how many roles can you have at one time with a big portfolio already? And I think that's a great place to start, is that just your position, without some of the other things that you've taken on, those are big responsibilities and have a huge scope as well. And then you've taken on other duties as assigned, you've stepped into acting roles, you've picked up things that needed to keep the ball rolling. Can you talk a little bit about your experience serving in these roles? And Vince, you kicked us off a little bit about the delegation pieces, the sort of types of challenges you find in there. And so maybe I'll go a little bit backwards around the circle this way. Can you talk to us a little bit about what it was like serving in those roles? Maybe pick one where you have multiple hats, and some of the challenges or leadership things you had to think about in those roles.
Well, I think when you come out of the role that you're normally working, you understand it. You understand the workload. And when you're doing your job and another, or being lifted up to do others, you need to understand what the competing expectations are that are going to hit you at any given time. Oftentimes, you're also put in a position where you are all of a sudden in a supervisory or leadership role over your peers, which is sometimes very interesting when you need to haul them in and let them know that they're doing something that needs to be changed pretty quickly. So you also need to understand how to be diplomatic in what you're doing. When I was acting at all times, I viewed myself as that. I acted with humility for the fact that I was entrusted with the responsibilities, but I remembered the office and door that I would be going back to after I was done and stayed in that mode. So I worked collaboratively across the process, but also there are times when I needed to put in structures so that I could make effective decisions. So when I was acting secretary, our exec sec process, because all the politicals knew each other very well, they had processes to get decision points up. Well, I needed to develop a process where I could make sure that when I was asked to make a decision, I understood what the organization's feedback would be, where the general counsel's office stood, and had to put in processes and procedures to help me make decisions and document them that may have been outside of the normal process, but I needed to make sure that we did everything right. So I would say it's looking at the competing expectations, understanding your stakeholders, having humility, understanding where you are and why you're doing this, and creating pathways that you can make conscious decisions. And on the career side, document those well, so it's understood why you did something. My goal in my career was to never be sued and never have to go before Congress. Well, I never had to testify before Congress, but when I was acting secretary, my name was used in a whole lot of lawsuits, but they were not personal. And so, you sort of think about all of this stuff when you go into these acting roles, and whether it's an acting branch chief or an acting executive in an agency, it's still fundamentally the same thing.
Yeah, that's a great, the trade-offs really in terms of some of these roles and some of the different risks and responsibilities. Nikki, love to get your perspective on this.
Yeah, Vince hit the nail on the head. The competing priorities, right, and expectations is always a challenge. So one, when you have new administrations or even new leadership, right, if it's not an entirely new administration, understanding what their priorities are and making sure that there's alignment in the functions that you are statutorily required to do. That's one, right? And then thinking about sustainability, especially serving in that kind of audit liaison role for the agency. Vince mentioned documentation, right? Are you documenting the processes that are changing so that they can at least be sustainable and allow for flexibility with change and leadership priorities? It's really that piece, because in multiple roles, you're going to have deadlines and deliverables. And fortunately, I was able to delegate. I know Vince was like, I didn't get to delegate, but delegating and understanding who your community is, who the stakeholders are, what the skill sets are, who's responsible for what. So a lot of times with working with some of my supervisors, hey, if you're not sure, do you have a RACI chart? Like using tools that are available to be very clear. If there's policies, every policy has a roles and responsibilities section. Who's supposed to do what? So you have something to hold someone accountable to, because that's one of the biggest things we say: if it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? And we know that it did, but there's no evidence. So that's really been key in working with that. And so one of the things was coming in. I talked about the council that chartered. We got the green light in a prior administration, but it hadn't been signed or implemented. So then coming into a new administration and really having to start that, for lack of a better phrase, marketing campaign all over again. Why do we need this? Why is this here? Especially with the focus on what we're required to do versus what we think is just a good practice, right? And so you needed to understand, are you being value added? So every conversation, what value am I bringing to the individuals that I'm speaking with? What is it that is important to them? And how can I kind of message this so that it's helping them reach their priorities and goals, which ultimately should all align. They should all fall in order. They should all be sequential, if not at the same time and concurrent. So, I think Vince, and not to pick on you, Vince, but you were the last one speaking. So Vince also mentioned communication. That is important because not every room is going to have the same type of listening ear, right? And so that value added piece is critical, because what may be important to, SMEs versus political appointees versus, our career, right, are going to be a little different, right? Because one is setting the vision, one is kind of scoping the vision, and one is implementing the vision, right? So knowing how to communicate to each of those stakeholder groups has really been important. So I'm sure there's so much more you could say, but in short, make sure you know the priorities and that you're aligning your vision and your scope to the mission, and then also setting clear expectations. So managing up is a thing. It's a real thing. Everyone should know how to manage up. It'll save you a whole lot of work, extra work that you find out you didn't necessarily need to do, if you know how to manage up in both ways, right? Top down and bottom up.
Thank you for that. Temika, over to you, because you've had some other experiences. We've got across all three of you, such a different range of the types of dual hats you've worn.
Yeah, certainly. But I have to say that my colleagues hit on much of what I was going to indicate as well. Because really, for me, the challenge has not necessarily been on the volume of work. It has truly been on the collision of priorities, as my colleagues have stated. When you lead across multiple functions, everything arrives labeled as urgent, right? So, but not everything's urgent. Your urgency may not be my emergency, right? So I have experienced periods where I was balancing congressional budget requirements, enterprise risks, technology modernization efforts, and workforce challenges simultaneously. Of course, each issue matters. They matter today, they mattered then, and they will probably forever matter. The leadership challenge was not, deciding where the most value or what will create the greatest value. Really, I call this urgency vortex, where leaders spend their time reacting to the loudest issue instead of focusing on the most consequential one. We see this a lot in IT with cybersecurity, but in my area at the Department of State, not to get into the specifics because it is intelligence, our competency isn't so much IT, it is intelligence diplomacy. But because there's a louder, entity needs more attention, the greatest risk, the other competency, the work that the mission, our true mission, is not being ignored, but been put on the wayside, or falling to the wayside, if you will. So the shift I had to make was moving from managing activities to managing outcomes. Instead of asking like task-based what needs to get done, I asked what outcomes are we trying to achieve, and where can leadership make the biggest difference? Because the most effective leaders are not necessarily the ones doing the most. They're the ones who consistently and constantly align time, energy, and resources to what matters most. So that's where the value that Nikki talked about is so crucial, because it's really not the squeaky wheel. It is what is really going to achieve the mission, timely, efficiently, and with less resources, unfortunately, because in today's climate, we're not getting a lot of them.
Yeah, listening to all of you share that follow-up question for whoever wants to jump in on this, or more than one of you, because there are these competing priorities potentially, or because there's just a greater volume of work as you have multiple roles and multiple portfolios, how do you get up to speed on some of those? Because they may not be, again, the work that you had been doing prior. And so you've got to step into a role where you aren't as familiar with what the priorities and the outcomes and some of those things. So how do you step into those roles, Vince?
So, I take a page from some of the good work the partnership has done in terms of presidential transitions. I mean, no matter what the role is, you need to arrange for yourself on paper and in person some briefings on the job that you're taking on. In a perfect world, you have the handoff from the prior to the current, but that doesn't always occur. And of course, even when you want to pass it off and do the same thing, but sometimes that isn't possible. So I've always viewed that any effective transition, whether it's presidential administrations or because you're acting Special Inspector General for administration when you were just heading HR, it doesn't matter what it is, you still need to understand what the issues are. But one thing I will say and this is something I have observed, as you get into the C-suite and the executive suite, the time you have, the increments of decision making or considering may have been 1 to 2 hours. As you go up in these roles, I mean, I was down at one point to 15-minute increments. And so everything needed to be tight. I needed bottom line upfront information, and I needed to have an understanding of the costs and benefits. And if I needed something more, then I would arrange a briefing afterwards. But it was just the volume of work and sorting that out and helping our teams, not only as you continue to learn, because we're in one of the roles, the first 2 weeks, I don't care what it is, you're going to be drinking from the fire hose. And after, even if you've had a good training and transition, you're still going to be learning new things. And frankly, people in the organization are going to try and game you. I mean, like, you can see them coming a mile ahead. And they're also the frequent emailer. So at some point you're like, ah, got it. Let's like move on. And so you have all of these dynamics. And again, it's not just things that I saw on my last acting gig. It's things that I saw in every one of them.
Oh my God. Can I jump in, Jenny, for a second? Vince, when you said bottom line up front, the sigh of relief. Like I talk to folks all the time and I said, look, if you send me 2 paragraphs and I'm in meetings or moving and you need a decision, if what you need from me is at the bottom, it's very likely you're not going to get a decision right then and there. Like, put it up front and then let me decide if yes, I have enough, I can make the decision or get into context. And I feel like as folks move up in their career to your point, the more you get into the C-suite, having to be able to hit it right away. This is what I need from you right here. And then kind of filtering it at a high level, why I need it from you, the impact of this decision, like pros, cons, whichever that may be. So I just had to jump in because I feel like there was an exhale. And like I say this all the time, put it right at the beginning or you might miss me just because of schedule, right? Competing priorities.
Mika, go ahead.
So I wanted to add simply not so much the competing priorities part, but what Vince indicated about aligning to the administration and their priorities, as well as to your agency, right? Wherever you're working, understanding what, the department or your agency or your entity, if you're at the state and local um, uh, area, I would say, I would focus on what's valuable to them. But the other piece I want to say is it's important when you're coming in to have constant meetings with your colleagues to understand what their priorities are, to see how you can help solve problems, see how you can be allies in meetings. I think that also helps. Including risk management to help rank and stack, which priorities are highest risk. So you get the biggest bang for your buck is also, something that I would add here as well.
One of the interesting things that occurs to me as I'm hearing you all speak is how much of a team sport it is, if you will, to be in the C-suite and holding down multiple roles, or even just your one portfolio, but really multiple roles, because you have to be working with your team, but also they have a role to play in helping support you all take on, these different roles. Is there a difference in the roles you've had and how you've approached them with that in mind, as whether you were acting in a political appointee role versus acting in multiple dual-hatted across multiple career roles?
I would say not for me. I've served in several acting leadership roles throughout my career. And one principle that has guided me is that the mission does not pause because the title is temporary. Acting leadership often face, in my opinion, 2 extremes. One, they can become overly cautious and delay decisions. And secondly, they can overcompensate and make changes simply to demonstrate leadership. The balance for me is what I call stewardship leadership, which means you recognize you are entrusted with the mission, the people, and the resources. Your responsibility is to keep the organization moving. That's it. You want to keep it moving forward. Address risks, solve problems, and try to create some stability. At the same time, you recognize you are not the permanent or owner of the organization. Instead, you have something far greater, which is being the steward of its future.
It's interesting in that sometimes when you're acting, you're being test driven for the role. And so I think there's a different approach that people have when they're in those roles. And frankly, probably all of us on this call have been in that situation before. And so you have a high need to achieve and show how you stand out in your capabilities. To a certain degree, that's a good thing about acting because it does also allow a person an understanding if it's something for them. I mean, some of the jobs I've acted in, I'm like, there's no way I want this job. Nothing. You couldn't, the SES salary is not near enough to do this. So let's get the job done and let's not, all those pet projects that people wanted. Well, this is not the time to do them. Although I will confess to you all, there were some things I wanted done at my department for a long time. And when I had the power to say, okay, get me the memo, I'm done waiting, this is going to be taken care of. So I think you also need to understand, when you're acting, you need to understand the circumstances. You need to understand how and what your leash is to get things done. Like what are the parameters that you can do? And I guess I've approached things with the sort of work when I've been acting, what is mission critical to the job that I need to make sure gets done? What's important but can wait and maybe should wait for the incoming appointee or the next person? And how do you move the ball forward so it doesn't need to just stop and start, but make it clear to everyone, we're going to continue on this, but this is not a decision that I should make in this capacity. But I want to make sure with a list of alternatives and a risk analysis and have all that ready for the incoming. So after they know where the restroom is and are comfortable in their office, they'll be ready to meet with us to talk about this. And then there's stuff where you're like, look, I'm not going to go there. So you all are just going to need to pipe down. We're not planning on this. We're not doing it. And the tough part is when you tell your peers no, that you're not going to do something, or no, I know I was one of the big mouths about it when I was a peer, but now I understand why we can't move forward on this. So we've just all got to do that. And to some respects, when those things happen, you also have a little bit more credibility with your peers in helping them understand perhaps some things that you didn't understand when you were advocating for a particular program activity before.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I
Nikki.
echo that. I think that unfortunately for me, I've been in acting roles and kind of been giving, hey, I need you to build this, right? Which is good, right? If you build and it works, but that's a lot of pressure, right? So a lot of times with acting, it's an opportunity to kind of say, I think Vince, you mentioned it, like what's not been working? What am I seeing coming into this new role? That some call it analysis paralysis, right? Like I've been in this position for so long, I can't see where the gaps are. I can't see where there's some gray areas that need to be adjusted. And so honestly, like each acting position, there's some that you wanted to do, right? Because it's an audition. And then there's some that you were kind of task told, right? Hey, I need you to act for this, right? Until we either find someone else or see if you like it and see if it works out. And I agree, there's some acting roles where it's like, oh man, that was a great experience. Glad, kind of check that box off, but we can keep moving now. But I will say it does expand your portfolio though, right? I remember acting in the budget space and not necessarily my bailiwick. However, you need to understand budget, right? In any space that you're in, you need to understand how the money is awarded, how it's allocated, where it's going, how it's being spent, and just the kind of rules and laws governing around it, even though the congressional process, right, and how that plays into the work that folks do. But from an acting perspective, it's really to what my colleagues have said, understanding the priorities. Like what is the priority here? And is it going to be a leadership just wants you to sustain and just keep things moving? Or is it that you're being put here because you need to kind of grow and mature whatever the functions or process are for that position? So
Temika, what did you call that? The leadership vortex?
yeah,
I love that.
that was great.
When you're acting, the vortex is now around you, even if you were creating the vortex or part of it before. And all of a sudden, also, you realize that in the new job, you weren't given an extra 4 hours in the day to get things done. So managing priorities and understanding what's most important and looking at the vortex that Dr. Edwards talked about and figuring out how you can tame it well enough for you to be successful acting is very important. I'm going to borrow that with attribution. I just want you to.
That's great. It's a good aha moment takeaway from this conversation. But you touched on something, all of you, about that I'm sitting here thinking about as I heard you talk about the scope of the roles. Is yes, you come at it from outcomes, you're intentional about priorities and strategies, but how do you all as individuals, like you said, there's not an extra 4 hours in the day. All of a sudden, you've got a lot of work, you've got 15 minutes to make decisions, you've got a ton of paper coming at you, or hopefully virtual paper, not the real paper, but sometimes. But how do you as individuals think about managing that, handling it? How do you think as leaders about dealing with the kind of weight and responsibility and just pressure of having these roles and multiple roles? Do you have any sort of things you do, perspectives you bring?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you what not to do, right? Like, don't just put it here and think that it's going to happen. That's what you should not do, where you just write it down and, oh, it's going to happen. One of the things is you have to really be organized. Think project management, right? Whether you have a team that helps you do that. I will honestly and transparently say I am not, the person that's going to write it in a book and then make sure it gets on my calendar, make sure it gets somewhere in OneNote or automated. But I have a great team that does. So lean on your system, but you do have to have some sort of project management organization, right? So if you know that that is not your strength, then you are going to have to make sure that it's very clear who can help you do that. I have milestones tables, right? So once we know what the expectation is, we know what needs to be done, you know the end goal. So let's plan it out, right? You do have to dedicate that time to really set milestones and understand what has to be accomplished to get to your outcome. So using milestone tables, using some sort of tool, whether that's OneNote, whether it's Task or whatever that may be. If you have an electronic pad, some of us do have iPads in the government or an electronic notebook, but just being very organized, right? Because I think for Temika and Vince, you can have all the deliverables and deadlines planned out, and there is always going to be something else, whether it's a different project or something that went wrong with that one that comes in and it could derail you. So if you don't have someone else, or this is the delegating or the team part, right, that can kind of help pick that up and make sure you're on track, or yourself set reminders if you can't delegate, that's really critical. So for me, it's the organization and kind of project management.
So if I may jump in, Jenny, you're a human first. And I have to remind myself that, right? And you cannot lead effectively if you're running on depletion. So that mindset helps me reset every time. Instead of reacting to everything, which can be overwhelming, of course, I focus on what actually requires my attention today versus what only feels urgent in the moment. So for me, that distinction alone creates space to think more clearly and respond more effectively. I use grounding questions like what absolutely must move forward right now, what could be shared or delegated. Sorry, Vince. So I'm not carrying it alone. And what can be intentionally paused without real consequence. Because the reality is not everything requires a same day solution. You may need time to sleep on it. And most things don't get worse overnight. So just pause and think about it. Know that there's always a tomorrow. That perspective helps me, is very critical. It helps me get through each of my daily portfolios because for my leadership, their priorities should be my priorities. But I oftentimes manage up to get them to think about, how much there's not enough time in a day and you only have a set amount of folks that can help you get the job done. So what should we be focusing our attention on? I also think that it's important to be transparent with others about capacity. I think for high performers, we tend to want to get things done right away, the best that we can, because we are the best and the brightest, but we also get burned out. So when others, including your team members, understand that there's a lot of weight, a lot of work to spread across the team, and you build that level of trust, everyone wants to help. And that's the environment we want to create.
I was muted, sorry. Vince, any other thoughts to jump in?
Well, I think fundamentally my colleagues on the panel are exactly right, and it gets back to what I said. There's not enough hours in the day to get everything done. And we all have different tools that we use to organize ourselves. But it's also very important as we use those tools to set expectations for our teams, no matter what they are, to get stuff done and to get it done in the right time frame. So yes, like 90% of the time, you can sleep on it and wait till the next day. But you also need your team to help you understand what the consequences are for the other 10% so that you can make a decision if you're going to sleep on it or need to move that day. And that's part of what we should expect and want from our teams when we're in any capacity. I view leadership roles and executive roles. It's not about carrying the organization yourself. It's about getting your teams and your employees and your people to help carry the mission together and remembering what the mission is. We can get lost in that, particularly when you're like in an acting role and maybe you've got to do your normal job. You've got some congressional responses you've got to clear and move forward, or legislative branch if you're state or local and listening on today. You've got your team that's coming up to you with questions. You've got your peers. And sometimes you need to report up to the executive about what you're doing and maybe move decisions forward. So you've got to prepare yourself for all of that. So it's about capacity, understanding the capacity around you, understanding what you need to know to make decisions, and then following through and understanding that the buck stops with you when you're acting. And I think that's important too, to learn from mistakes. And also, if you make a decision and maybe it wasn't the right one, being accountable for that, but then moving on and getting to the next challenge.
You all mentioned teams, and something I think about when I had two separate roles at one time was that I had also two separate teams that went with those two separate roles and portfolios. So all of a sudden I was overseeing also double the amount of teams, people, supervisees, direct reports. How have you all, in your roles currently or in your previous roles, how do you sort of approach helping the team, step into leading maybe a separate team? Is it one team? Have you combined the teams? How have you thought about the people piece of it?
I can go first, Jenny. So one thing is I've always recommended one cross training, right? For a lot of the teams, it can't be a one person show, right? Because that person's out, something happens. As Temika said, we're human first, making sure that there's cross training. Another way that's really more forward looking or forecasting is, when we do budget requests for training, like what's your training request? What is it that you need? Making sure that they really understand the skill set, right, of their teams and what they have, just from a daily functioning, right? There, of course, is the project side, but check-ins are key. I have a lot of 15-minute check-ins, right? And that can shift, right? One week, I need a 15-minute check-in on the payment integrity side. Another week, I need multiple 15-minute check-ins because there are some audit issues or we're in our annual financial statement audit season. So that's really fast moving. And sometimes we don't use them, but we have them. I think those check-ins are really key because it allows you to have early identification and response to any issues or anything that's coming up. Like I don't have to wait until our bi-weekly or weekly. We're having that, hey, want to put it on your radar. Okay, let's talk quickly. This is what I need, or this is what they need. So those check-ins and that engagement is critical, right? And then we talked about RACI charts, roles and responsibilities, making sure it's very clear what the expectation is, right? This is what I'm expecting. This is what I need. The more senior the person is, it's a little bit more about here's the outcome I need. This is when I need it, right? And then there's more, there's a space for them to kind of figure out how exactly to get to that outcome within boundaries, right? Or within scope. But the biggest thing, it sounds so minor, but 15-minute check-ins, but they have been extremely value added to know if there's something that needs to be elevated or if there's a quick decision that needs to be made.
Yeah, that's very helpful because we live in a fast-paced environment. Things move so fast that those check-ins are helpful. Temika or Vince, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Nikki indicated about cross training for sure and setting clear expectations. When I think of this, I think of simply what Vincent indicated about sometimes you can't sleep on it. You have to do, you have to do the work now. And so in some cases where I have cross-functional teams, I may have to surge based on what needs to happen now. It's all hands on deck. So for me, one of the most important lessons I've learned is to, not rely heavily on those high performers, really ensuring that the staff has the training to cross functions to support wherever necessary, because just really relying on those high performers, puts them in a vulnerable state and creates an environment that is not conducive. It's just not helpful from a morale perspective, and it creates a lot of imbalance and burnout. So as a leader, I have to be intentional about how I allocate work, not just based on capability, but based on sustainability, because I want them for the long haul. Of course, I want to grow them. And if they, are promoted, great, but I want them to continue to work for me happy. So strong performance should not become a pathway of overload. One of the principles that I appreciate from Brene Brown is where she talks about clear is kind, unclear is unkind, because clarity is not just about communication, it is about a form of care. It reduces unnecessary stress, builds trust in leadership decisions, and creates the condition for people to perform at high levels. So I say all of that to say that, yes, I have multi-functions. They are in their lane, but when necessary, I surge and have them work as a team. And I tell you, I mean, we're the closest team. I've had the closest teams in my career, and even now, because of it, because we know that when something hits the fan, we have each other's back. But it's because focusing on people was first, with training, giving them the support that they need, providing them with clear expectation up front, and pivoting along the way has been key to managing my teams and their success.
I love that people focus. Vince, you came off mute.
So one of the keys that I've had throughout my career, one of the themes in terms of leadership is people support what they help to create. It's a very simple sentence that I learned at my very first class in undergraduate, and I remember it to this day. I remember even the classroom when I heard that statement. It's nothing real profound, but it reminds me, as Temika said, and Nikki said, you need to bring people along with you no matter what leadership role that you're in. And you need to understand that the best decisions are not necessarily those decisions that are made in the corner offices that are a lot bigger with the extra big windows. It's the people who run and manage programs every single day. They generally understand how to fix the programs if people would listen to them. So I didn't just use that when I was acting. That's sort of how I've tried to approach leadership roles that I've been in. When you're acting, you may not have a full understanding when you start of your authority and the risks with the role. So you need to build all of that in. But no matter, if you don't know how long you're going to serve, if you, weren't appointed through a traditional process, even if some people view you as temporary that are your colleagues, at the end of the day, the employees look at you as the leader. And so they're going to follow your cue. And if you bring them to the table when you're challenged with those vexing things that you're like, I didn't, know that I signed up for this decision when I was acting, but here it is. And so I got to pull the right people around the table, listen to them, and then create a scenario where you can make decisions on tough challenges. When I was acting, we had everything from facilities closures and how that was going to impact our team, to dealing with some mission related issues like the investigations that we are hired to conduct. And as those were coming up, what would that mean? How would we share information with the public? How would we brief the politicals? I mean, all of this stuff came into play. And I like to say, because I did presidential transition stuff and learned from Jen and the team there about all of that. But sometimes when you're acting, it doesn't matter what training you've had. you're going to have a shocker. You're going to have something you're going to have to get through, and you're going to have to follow and work with the people who are there with you. And then, frankly, to a certain degree, trust your own instincts, your own thoughts, your own analysis, and frankly, your gut. And that's when you're going to have to make the tough calls to get things done. Because when you're in the public sector, ultimately, that's what we're being paid to do, to making sure that those services or what our mission is implemented. And I always tried in that focus of mission first, remembering that the second most important part of that equation to the mission, or the most critical thing to the mission, was the people. You could even get away with systems issues, everything else, but if you didn't have people in place, then you couldn't effectively execute the mission. So
thank you for that. Pivoting a little, because we do have a question in the chat here in the Q&A. Going back to something you've all talked about, and you mentioned a little bit in this last answer too. The question is, how do you navigate competing priorities where you may not agree with one course of action, but will be responsible for the outcome? And so I think to this, I'm looking at it, you've got competing priorities, and maybe even some of them are in conflict or in tension with each other because of timelines and staff and capacity. And so you don't necessarily agree with the course of action of one. You've got to navigate to others. How do you handle that? Nikki, you've jumped off mute.
Yeah, well, I'll say course of action versus compliance and unethical, legal are two different things, right? So one is very clear, right? We just maybe need to provide more information on, hey, here's the impact if we go in this direction, right? And that's that, as we mentioned earlier, bottom line up top. Okay, if you want to go direction A, here's the impact. This is going to impact the agency in this way. This could be an ADA violation, a number of things. But if it's a course of action because there's just two competing priorities and they conflict, then you really need to lay that out. Like, hey, okay, going in this direction, or let's say we are doing internal control testing and folks are preparing their assurance packages that go up to the secretary or administrator, right? That end up going to President, Congress, and the public to say, hey, my controls are effective, reasonably effective. If someone is, and this can happen, you're getting results that indicate that a process is not working or controls are failing. However, in that same sentence, oh, but I'm going to give assurance that everything's working and great, right? And that can happen. And I'm sure it has happened, right? And then you're kind of put in a position with those two competing, let's say, statements, for lack of a better phrase, where you really as a leader have to go in and, I don't want to say negotiate it, right? But kind of unwind it to explain, hey, here's why doing this is not in alignment with the statutory definition of providing reasonable assurance. By definition, if you have a material weakness at the agency level. So sometimes you really just have to break it down and use the regulations and law to your advantage, right? They're there. Use it, and everything has to be based in that, because guess what? If I say this is what the law is, this is the interpretation, sometimes that requires counsel, sometimes it doesn't. When someone pushes back, then they fully understand what they're pushing back on. At that point, it's their decision, and you have everything documented, right? If it's that direction. If it's just a matter of, I like to do things this way, and I'm getting direction to do it another way, you need to be able to be adaptable, right, to change, because that's really what we experience with new leadership, right? Different ways to get to the same outcome. And so you can't really look at it from my way or the highway, right? You have to go in with an open mind that there's more than one way to achieve the same outcome, just making sure that you are doing it the most efficient way that doesn't create more work, for your organization.
So, we wouldn't want to move into a house that was just built by someone who had a great idea. You want to make sure the permits are there. You want to make sure someone who is thoughtful and understands this takes a look at it and make sure that everything is sturdy and that the walls are not going to fall in. Well, it's the same thing when you're acting. So I viewed one of the architects that I needed to bring to that table was always one of the attorneys from our general counsel's office, because I wanted to understand what's the framework? What's the legal history? What's the history of any court action on these sorts of issues? Are we legally sustainable if we go one direction or another? And what are the consequences of that? And then pulling in some of the right experts to weigh in and share the information they need. So whatever the outcome is that you have, you've had the benefit of others who spend their entire careers often managing the sorts of programs that we're asked to temporarily lead. And I think that's an important factor. I used to say to the attorneys, look, I'm going to be your best client. And it's not because I want to keep you busy in court. It's because I want to work with you on the front end so that we don't end up somewhere where none of us want to be.
Yeah, and definitely don't want to be on the Washington Post. So I would say, in terms of conflicting priorities, just one example, again, without getting into too many details about it, we had a Hill request to expand IT internationally, but within the department, our priority was to strengthen the system first. And so for us, we had to be creative with letting our Hill staffers know and authorizers know that we understand it's a priority. However, we will get there. So no, not right. It's not a no, but it's a not right now. We're going to focus on that house that Vince talked about, which strengthening the foundation of our house domestically before before sending a system over to an international location or locations, I should say. So, I mean, I think the moral of that is, sometimes there will be competing priorities. A lot of times there actually will be competing priorities. But sometimes you just have to be creative in your approach. Again, you have to be transparent about why you're not going to do it right now, and understand that just having that clarity and that openness with internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, not it doesn't make the priority go away, but it helps to reduce the order of priority. So maybe it's not the top priority, but maybe it's the second or third area that you would focus on once you complete that massive priority. I mentioned this up front. When you're looking at priorities, start racking and stacking them. Come up with some sort of risk methodology or structure that you could talk about the impact, the cost implication, the legal implication, and determine how you would focus on an activity or a task or a priority over the other, and really what value that will bring to the organization. Yes, there probably will be 2 or 3 high risk, but then you talk about velocity. What's going to hit you the fastest? What's going to hit your organization the fastest to help with those competing priorities? We didn't agree with what our Hill staffers wanted us to do again right now, but it is something that we will do in the future once we build. So you're not going to always agree with what others are asking you to do, but you have to, if it's not illegal or against the law or going to get you on the Washington Post, then give it a try. Be open-minded, especially in this climate where you can't continue to operate in the status quo.
Yeah, and Jenny, I just want to say one thing because I know you're going to say it's almost time. I mentioned earlier in my intro, like pushback creates opportunities for clarity. In leadership roles, you have to know how to diplomatically and strategically push back, right? Because sometimes the clarity is, okay, maybe there's additional context I needed to understand, or I need to give you some additional context so that you're clearer on why this may not be the right next step to take. So, I keep saying one day I'm going to put it on a t-shirt, but maybe pushback doesn't have a positive connotation with it, but it really is that, right? It's like, don't stop engaging. And just because your first thought is like, I don't think that's the right thing to do, or that doesn't align, like, give that additional context. Now, I will say you have to know when and where to do that. There are some situations in some rooms where that is not the right time or place to do the pushback, or you need to follow up after the conversation. And it depends on where the direction is coming from as well. But I always welcome my team to, if they say, well, I'm not sure. Okay, tell me why. Tell me why, because they may know something I don't. So sorry, Jenny.
Nikki, I think you talk about what we could all learn from Dr. Edwards because of where she works. diplomacy comes into play in this. And I remember when I was younger, someone said diplomacy is the art of telling someone to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip. And, I always think about that when I deal with folks from the State Department. But, look, we're in a tough period in government, not just at the federal level. For those who are in state and local government, there's a lot of disruptions going on to government itself, but also around us. I mean, AI, all of these things that are happening are creating times where people have unease when we have a lot of change. And anyone who's been around the block knows that in any organizational culture, change management is the most important thing. And it is also the most difficult to achieve. So for those people who are on the call and for those of us who are acting, we need to have eyes wide open to what's going on around us, because that will help us navigate that. As we're acting now, we're not in the same positions, even if we've acted, that we may have been 5 years ago. In a time I think that really changed everything with the old order for those of us who have been around was the pandemic, because the way we did business completely changed after that. And I still think right now we're in the process, we're years out from that, but we're in the process of figuring out new ways to do things. And that includes acting in roles, that includes leveraging your teams in different ways. And some of that can be daunting, but some of that, frankly, is exciting. And for those of us who have had the honor to act in some capacity, it's not just because we were the only person in the room. It's because the people who were leaving or the people who oversee it trusted our ability to handle those tasks, but to serve as the person who would take care of the culture through the process. So when you get the nod, it's not just because you're the smartest person in the room, although you may think that. It's because of something even greater, your stewardship for an organization and your service. And that's what it's all about, in my opinion.
And Vince, that's such a good reminder that this is where there is challenge, there's also opportunity for folks, there's leadership opportunity. And this is, part of why we all work in government and have worked in government is because of the mission and the service. So, before we wrap up, because we are getting to the end, real quick, lightning round. One to 2 words. If you had a leadership skill that you recommend folks leverage, grow, lean into as they're in this time of disruption and maybe multiple roles, what would it be? Nikki, go ahead.
Understand the type of leader you are. And the reason I say that is because it's going to help you understand how you need to lead and how you need to receive. Um, and that sounds very simple. It's a little bit more complex, right? It all centers around authentic leadership, right? Like understanding your leadership style, how you best connect with people. I think everything we said in this panel really gets to, dealing with change management, which is absolutely a big thing. But just really understanding, what your successes have been in leadership and where you've had some challenges and maybe could learn from an experience and make an adjustment so that it's not cyclical. So just being an authentic definitely helps to make sure that the work that you're doing, that you actually believe in the mission as well.
That's great. Temika.
I would say strategic prioritization. When paired with systems thinking and communication, it reminds systems thinking, I would say, would remind us that very few challenges exist in isolation. Prioritization is what matters. Connection is what influences it. Communication is what drives it. This is how, in my perspectives, leaders can turn complexity into coordinated actions. So that's what I would leave you with.
That's great. Vince, in about 20 seconds, bring us home here.
So when you're acting, it's not about you, it's about the mission and it's about the people. And know your limits of what you can and can't do so that you can lead your teams successfully. And again, Dr. Edwards, what you just said, amazing. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being here today. This was excellent. And really, I know I learned a lot. And thank you to all the folks listening in on this. If anybody missed it, this will be on our YouTube channel. You can also visit the Public Service Leadership Institute website for more resources, as well as this recording. And we know everyone's busy, so really, really appreciate your time, and stay tuned for other Leadership Lab conversations. And again, to our panelists, this was fantastic. Really much gratitude to all of you. And thank you everyone for your service. And I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.